So, Praveen, I remember going back a few years. Maybe it was when we were developing the white paper, thinking about real estate as a very particular kind of asset class that um, is probably for a bookstore the largest expenditure, either for rent. Um, what would it mean for bookstores to own rather than have to rent? Um, And I don't mean to get us focused on that in particular, but to throw that out as an example, if if reimagining bookstores were to think, looking at the landscape right now, of what are the three biggest challenges for bookstores, and to take those challenges as a kind of agenda for reimagining bookstores for the next 12 months. And being really, hopefully, items that are connected um, strategically and critically to sustainability, um, and taking that forward both as a message, but really as an information gathering and hopefully recommendation making process.
One of the interesting models, Paul, that kind of in some ways is alongside what you're talking about is uh, this guy Darryl Peck, who we're talking to, has Right On Books, and then another bookstore down in Georgia, or that's in Georgia. He has another bookstore in Connecticut. Incredible businessman. He had the largest chain of Apple stores in the country and sold it, and stuff. Um, he believes in having the biggest expense is stocking a complete bookstore with a fairly large space. And what he capitalizes on is he sells books that, as far as I always knew, don't make any money, which is photo and illustration books, large format coffee table books almost. And he found that what he does is he has the biggest collection of each. So people come to him because they know he's bound to have what they want. And he argues that by having the capital, which he clearly has, um, to buy it and start with a whole big inventory, which is different than Lisa, your thing about inventory turn. He also, I'm sure, from what he said, does a lot of buying and selling. Um, is Makes his store very sustainable. He has a bunch of other retail practices that he follows that he learned in having a lot of retail businesses. But one of the main ones just starting with a very large resource of books, which I thought was fascinating. We've heard a lot of other stories from the bookstore owners we've talked to, Lisa and I, but that one I hadn't heard before.
I
I
think
want
we're
to back
working.
up out of the specifics and stick with this. Um, Paul, Paul made an interesting suggestion. Do we have, first off, a clear enough sense? Is this really about um, reimagining uh, bookstores to be sustainable in service to a thriving community?
I think so
Yeah,
because
yeah.
we hear about bookstores that are for sale. I don't know what, twice a week, Lisa, Praveen. And the model for that is someone has had a bookstore for 10, 15, 20 years in a community. They've decided to retire. They can't do it anymore. And then they put it up for sale. And then there's just this waiting around for someone to buy it. And that either works or it doesn't work. In my mind, it never works because whoever's buying it has made a mistake because they are putting money into something that is not going to give that return. So it would be interesting to be able to consider a bookstore as a community good, that the first step for someone who's going to close or step out of their bookstore would be to engage the community and like municipality landlords and say, okay, this is an opportunity for the community to kind of come on board with this bookstore and figure out a way for either community ownership, um, customer funded ownership, just a transfer of assets or something like that. And like that step gets skipped, When Kepler's reopened twice, it was at the behest really of the community and with the community. So I think that could be important. And I think some of the bookstores who are really being successful now are those with benevolent landlords or engaged community, where the desire is for that space to be kept, not privatized.
I have a unique opportunity to see people who don't participate in the ABA or any of the IBAs or any of the forums, but have successful bookstores. And they're out there. Darryl Peck is one of them. He has participated in the SEBA, but not barely, and has a very different view of things. And I'm working with a guy in Denver right now who has a very different view of things. He's a businessman that is doing. I am seeing and trying to document emergent models, and they're really different in terms of inventory and turn and purpose and how they go about it. They're book centric, but they are business models. And so there are successful models out there. It isn't prevalent, and there isn't just one way. There are multiple ways. And I'm going to argue with myself and say that there are some successful models out there, and they're just quietly churning and doing their thing. There aren't a lot of them, but they are there. Politics and Prose has a successful model. They employ a couple hundred people. They do a lot of stuff, but they don't like to play with everybody else anymore. And they have their own cohort of like 23 bookstores that meet up annually. So there's these pockets of learning that I think are possible. And what I was excited about in the original Reimagining bookstore is I think it invited those people out to play and or in to contribute their insights. And I think we need that. If what we want to produce is something helpful to those who want to bring books into thriving communities. And I guess that's the point, Peggy, that I would ask is like, what's our end game? What would success look like for us as a group?
Great question. What do you think?
Way it's a discussion about process and strategy, and for me, it's about taking the long view, which is, I think, when you look at Kepler's, and you guys taking over what, 12? What is that? That's a long time. 13 years.
Tell me about it.
Man, and but the great thing is you had a vision, and this is what I think reimagining was about, like Lisa says, about the long view, not about a short-term fix, not about just injecting some learning and money and resources into something and then moving on to the next project. But it isn't about the Emerson model. It's about something that's different and in a way in opposition to it, which is you can't keep fixing something that's not working. So how do we create something that is working, not only for the people working there, the living wage and the sustainability, but for the community? In Brooklyn, when our bookstore closed, it was devastating to the community. It was just devastating.
So success looks like a healthy relationship, a bookstore seen as an integral and vital hub of the information health of a community. Is that an aspect of it?
Yeah, and the fact that it's a long journey. It's a journey. It's not a task.
I believe that bookshops are if we look back in history, bookshops have always saved us. They brought us Stoic wisdom. They brought us Republic. They've been the thing that Napoleon feared the most. Bookshops are to me, a means to the survival of our country. And I want to identify, I think success looks like identifying um, the productive partnerships necessary and the business thinking necessary to bring those bookshops to every community across the country. And to give lots of people the opportunity so that it is an anomaly when someone is successful with a bookshop, but it becomes something that can happen repeatedly all over in every community. Because I think that's our best bet at turning around the trajectory that we're currently on.
I remember way back when, feeling as if the mission of reimagining bookstores was to preserve bookstores somehow in amber, to
Who
simply,
thought that?
yes, to preserve bookstores as we know them and love them and keep them that way. That was part of what I sensed from this project. Sorry, Peggy, that's just the way I was
I'm,
thinking.
I'm just gobsmacked about that because
I mean, Jurassic Park is trending right now, so
yeah.
Well,
So
I
go
think
on.
we're kind of about the opposite of that. Yeah.
But if I could continue.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
it sounds in this conversation, and I love the turn this conversation seems to be taking. What is the gist of bookstores? What is it about bookstores we want to protect, defend, and perpetuate? And that's what we want to see continued. Maybe that's what success looks like. But bookstores don't have to look like how they look now. Um, and I continue to wonder about the models for preserving what is best. And here I do mean to preserve. Um, and so I'm suddenly fascinated by questions about inventory and turnover, as well as continuing questions about the cost of the cost of different kinds of expenses, like real estate. Um, but but to give bookstores a sense of what we want the success of reimagining bookstores to look like, and translate or transfer that vision to them collectively.
Or engage them in catalyzing that vision, naming it. In other words, this isn't a small group cooking up a vision on high, but a process for engaging them in naming a vision that they mobilize around.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, it strikes me. I was saying to Praveen behind the scenes, one of the things I'm seeing in the local independent journalism world is a call for what they're calling a field level agenda. And I wonder, and as I've been hearing that, I've been thinking there's a practice that Praveen and I suspect Paul is familiar with called future search, which is really about creating such a thing. And I'm wondering if there's been enough turning of the soil, if you will, the breaking up of the hard pan that we did with reimagining bookstores, that we're now at a place where some kind of invitation to imagine that vision and agenda together for what bookstores can be now um, might be a useful next step where we bring the whole system, the publishers, the real estate developers, the readers, other aspects of creating a thriving community. That may be going too far. Or, different parts, the local journalists into the system and invite kind of this next level of conversation around what is the gift of bookstores that we want to protect, defend, and perpetuate. I don't know that I'd frame it quite that way, but what is it that bookstores bring to the revitalization of communities?
Well,
So-
I think, oh, the last question, I think we've answered. What do they bring to the revitalization of community? But we could go deeper, more deeply. I love the idea of future search and of looking at that, kind of what I was talking about earlier, that I think this is the way that we change our world. That's a different piece than putting the principles, the practical principles together that help bookshops survive. I work in small manufacturing, the other least likely business in America, because everything is stacked against it. Where we make bookshelves for bookstores, but only 40% of the time, because if we did it 100% of the time, we would be broke very quickly, because the cost of acquisition of each client is so high. There's all these decisions to be made. There's all these things to be done. And the long-term value of the client is very low because they're going to make one decision and do one thing. And that's not a business model that anybody in manufacturing can pursue. So we do 60% something else. But what we're looking at is how do we help more manufacturing be sustainable in America? Because if you look historically, you don't find societies exist very long without making something, without producing something, whether that's growing their own food or, making things. And that's a story problem too, but we're putting together the answers. There's lean manufacturing, there's inventory, there's, owning your building, there's, using your building, there's solar power that gets you off of the grid and pays for it. There's all of these elements that are very practical elements. And then there's forming partnerships with people who care about the same industry, who are willing to be helpful. And I think all of those principles are portable. They come straight over here to the bookstore world, where we say we want to do this great thing for all these great reasons, and we need a practical set of partnerships, alliances, agreements, and tools in order to do it. So that's a piece that's different than the what value do they add and why, and our big why, which I think we're all in touch with too.
So we've got about 15 minutes. And I'm wondering, as you think across the scope of the conversation that we've been having, where are you now? If you had to name what's next for us, what is it in your mind? And I'm thinking we each take a moment to reflect on that and name where you're at, and let's see if any threads emerge.
One idea. So, okay, I'll go first. What the hell? So this could sound kind of crazy, but I'll say it. So first of all, I like Lisa's line about bookstores and what Napoleon feared the most, particularly this. I think that's a great fucking line. And so So Lisa knows a little about this. There's a Latino guy who has 2 or 3 restaurants in town, but he also has a medium-sized coffee house, and he keeps talking to me about turning it into more of a bookstore, this coffee house downtown. And we've danced around it, and uh, but this conversation has made me want to pick up the phone when we finish and call him up and say, let's do it, because I have an idea around an immigrant bookstore, a bookstore, because we have a very large Latino community, and we have a lot of people that support them and trying to figure out how to support them. So there's sort of a mission there that there is not sort of there is a mission there that fascinates me. And so I like the idea of starting a bookstore with a concept and a mission and maybe a space and some coffee. So that's where I'm at, is that whatever and he and I both he's a really good restaurateur. He's managed to survive everything and he does really well. Um, one of his restaurants is called Hole in the Wall. And he really attracts an interesting mix of people. Anyway, I like the idea of starting a bookstore with a mission. I think it's much harder to take a bookstore that exists with people who love books and stepped in and now want to fix it. And they think somehow with a hybrid model or whatever, they're going to create a mission. And so to me, that mission thing and that what Napoleon feared the most is the most inspiring thing I've heard in a way.
If a new immigrant bookstore comes into being as a result of this conversation, I think that would be a big win.
I think that too. I think I can just see that at the top, the immigrant bookstore, and underneath it says what Napoleon feared the most.
And below that, F you, Trump. But
No, that's implied.
Yeah, it's implied.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you see as next? What's next coming out of this conversation? And I'll add the qualifier for reimagining bookstores. Is there a there?
I would say that I feel I've been in this conversation for a long time just because I was in it with Praveen before as well. I think that everyone's bookstore mission-based is a unique thing. And I noted that when you guys talked about the purpose of reimagining is that there's no two that are the same. But I do go back to what is it that people need? Like, is there, and not a product necessarily, but I get that idea of a product. We've talked before, Praveen, about like social franchise. A lot of people go into bookstore not knowing how to run a business. They just love books, just not necessarily a recipe for success. People don't start a newspaper because they like to read the paper. They tend to start a newspaper or work for a newspaper because they have a journalism degree. There's a lack of follow through from an education point of view. But would there be a way to come up with an ability to have something so that there's a way to engage with your community if you want to take over a bookstore, or there's a way to negotiate a lease that's favorable, that there is a grant that you can get that's starting, that I don't know, that there's just that you're signing on to do something and that you have support, and it's not just a playbook, you know what I mean? But somehow you're in a community, you're not alone. You're within a franchise where there's weekly meetings on how it went, or there's communal, your shared communal resources for inventory or leverage, you know what I mean? That there's just something that says, you need to take this and make it yours, but you've already got the suit. I don't know. Anyway, that's just what I've been thinking about.
Well, I mean, that is the new paradigm. What I've been calling the new paradigm, you just gave a lot of description and just life to that. The new paradigm is not starting a bookstore by first thinking about which publisher you need to open an account with or which real estate space you're in love with. it starts with a conversation with your community because you're starting a bookstore to serve your community. So centering the whole paradigm into the community that you're starting something new. So if Steve is going to start a new bookstore to serve the immigrant community, he's got to start with a conversation with the immigrant community and say, I'm thinking of starting a bookstore to be a home for all of you. And what do you think of this idea? And how do you want to be part of it? So you're starting with the conversation and you're just centering the whole thing from the beginning into, you're doing something because you want to better the community. You want to make the community better, stronger, more resilient, more Napoleon proof, whatever you want to do. And so, the more we can center this new paradigm in kind of being community centric and not publisher centric, I mean, I think that's what we need to do.
So there are a lot of things. Go ahead, Lisa.
No, you go ahead, Paul.
There are a lot of things in this conversation that are exciting for me. The things that stand out that make me want to encourage us to think about including them in some kind of agenda. The focus on communities, thriving communities, sustainability. I love the idea of expanding what we're seeing and what we're thinking through the community lens. And I know we've touched on that before, but it feels much bigger now. I'm also sitting here listening to everyone feeling a sense of urgency that I didn't feel before. There's a really big, fat, ugly bull running through the china shop and causing a lot of damage. And I think focusing on a community system makes sense to me. Thinking locally again, or helping others think locally, but also thinking of members of the community across the country. And Steve, I love your idea because I'd also encourage us to think experimentally. If we could experiment on anything for the next 12 months, what would that experiment be? And by experiment, I mean really trying something that we might not otherwise think of doing, but having deep, reflective, organizing conversations for sure, but also thinking in experimental mode. And what could we come up with?
I'll send you the video of the interview. I think we have it with this little bookstore in Brick Road in East London called Libraria that we keep using as an example, where he broke down all the categories. There's no fiction, nonfiction, or anything. There's just themes, and it's a brilliantly designed store, tiny store that's having huge impact. I'll send you something about it because
Great.
that was an experiment. Lisa and I kept talking about what are the experiments? Can we get them on so people can learn from the other people's experiment?
So
Well,
let's, Lisa.
Well, personally, that's exactly, Paul, what you hit on two big pieces. One, Steve and I, we keep saying over and over, you can't do anything can't write a book unless you know who it's for. And knowing the community, knowing who your store is for is the beginning of any business model. I've got my favorite book on pattern language, which is if you know me for 5 minutes, you know that I love this book. I think we are this group. This was the group that started social architecture. This was the group that traveled the world, and they said if they saw a pattern more than 8 times, they called it a pattern language, a language of healthy, human, sustainable architecture. I think what we are observing are patterns of healthy, sustainable architecture of bookstores in communities. And I echo the urgency. I mean, I think we're doing two things. One, we're creating something that could be useful as pattern languages, healthy, sustainable, everything from the physical setting to the financial setting to the inventory and the payroll, all of the pieces. And there's lots of different patterns. Every home doesn't look the same in here, but it's just the idea of principles that draw us together. And we have been experimenting and we have been learning from each other, and we can document some of those patterns and be helpful. And maybe in an organic, when we look at what's next, maybe we capture some of those patterns of success, those pathways of success, maybe we call it that. And also, I don't want to forget the thread of what's next. I mean, Praveen posed a question that hasn't been answered around, Praveen and Amanda have been talking about it in a long time: sustainable wages, partnerships with publishers. That's the elephant in the room, that we need a pathway to. And maybe there's different pathways to publishers. Maybe there's partnerships with independent presses that can work differently. There's a lot of different possibilities. Anyway, what's next? I think if we think of ourselves like a research team that are putting together these pathways, we can create the architecture that maybe could be as powerful as this to somebody else.
Lisa, I was privileged to know the author of that book. So
You did?
Oh
yes,
my God.
You knew Christopher Alexander?
yes.
So,
Wow.
we notice 32 consistent pattern languages in use in bookstores that are successful. 32 of them. I've documented at least 12 times. So I've been capturing these methodically for the last decade. And it's exciting to say, here's part of the magic and how it comes together. And I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about healthy human systems and bookstores as part of that infrastructure, and creating healthy bookstores. So it's the brick and mortar of the bookstore itself. What are those pieces? And how do they get their water? All of the stuff.
I
You
love
knew
that.
Christopher Alexander. I have odd heroes, and I've got to go get with one because Jeffrey Rosen is hosting something in about 2 minutes that I have to get onto. But yeah, thank you. And Jeffrey is doing a thing called The Pursuit of Liberty, his new book, which is about how we began in division. And if you read that, it's really, you see Caesar and you see the bull and you see the current urgency, and we all feel it.
Lisa and Peggy, one quick thing. I did talk to Feroz about the documentary that he's doing with Jeff Kinney, and they still have more to shoot, one more big scene to shoot with Jeff, and he's been hard to reach. And then they really resume editing. And from my experience, the editing could go on for 6 months. So I don't think they think they'll finish in 2 or 3 months. I don't think it'll be done till the end of the year at the earliest. Just so you know.
So I've heard about 3 different directions next steps can go. An experiment, just go do it, see what we can learn from it, as Steve is naming. In a way, create a pattern language. And Praveen, I think what I heard you talking about was, putting the support structures in place based on what we've learned for them to be successful and thriving, supporting their communities, thriving themselves and their communities to thrive. Pattern language is a solution to doing that. And I'd love to see your patterns, by the way, having seen several other creation of pattern languages. We're out of time. I don't know what the energy is for pursuing any of those goals. I think this larger intent of reimagining bookstores to be sustainable and service to thriving communities, or what can bookstores bring to the revitalization of communities, however we choose to say it, holds these possibilities. And there's no saying we all have to do them together. And they could still be all under this frame of reimagining bookstores. So, frankly, my thought is that we sit with what this looks like and continue. Frankly, I don't like to continue a framing conversation this long, but we haven't landed in a place where everyone is going, yes, let's move. So
Can I suggest, Peggy, that you provide us a structure? Maybe would you be willing to do that so that we have a final framing conversation that with the result of an actionable direction? Is there a structure you can think of that would help us do that?
I can give it some thought, but there are no guarantees.
Yeah, there never are. We all cats here.
Um,
I think
And
that's
there
a
may
good
be-
idea.
I can look in your book.
yeah, there may be some homework
There may be some in here
associated with it.
or
Yeah.
homework associated. Yeah.
Why don't we meet
I mean,
again in a week? Can we meet again in a week so we can sort of resolve all this? And Peggy, if you could, I mean, maybe it's enough time for you, but if it was, it would be great to have sort of, one of your processes, a tight version of one of your processes for us.
We could always use a Kepner-Trago methodology like situation appraisal and decision analysis, something like that, something that forces us into
It's too rational.
too rational. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would probably go more to an appreciative inquiry, which might involve some paired conversations before we come together again. I'm open to giving a little thought to that if you think it would be useful.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you want to set a date to come back together now, or would somebody take responsibility for?
What about 2:00 a week from today? 2 o'clock
Today is
Pacific time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't make it. I have a doctor's appointment.
Okay.
Well, actually, I'm thinking about canceling that appointment, so it might actually give me the onus to go ahead and cancel it, and then it works for me.
Praveen, you